Brianna, how did you enjoy the Trump town hall on CNN?
I know it's not appropriate to say this, and we'll get into the media criticism of it all, but I was nothing if not entertained. It is what it is. Trump back on the screen has the quality that made millions of people tune in for The Apprentice, and we should definitely start digging into what lessons Democrats should learn from their own performance and how they can connect to independent voters if that's something they're really invested in doing going forward in 2024.
Well, this is, in fact, our first topic of conversation for the morning. Trump took questions from Caitlin Collins on CNN and also from the audience. He did not shy away from airing his grievances about the 2020 election. Take a look.
Most people understand what happened. That was a rigged election, and it's a shame that we had to go through it. It's very bad for our country. All over the world, they looked at it. And they saw exactly what everyone else saw. You look, even if you just look recently with the 51 intelligence agents, that made a 16-point difference. If you look at the FBI, if you look at the FBI and Twitter, they call it Twitter files, made a big difference. If you look at
Mr. President, back to what you just said there, though, it was not a rigged election. It was not a stolen election. You and your supporters lost more than 60 court cases on the election. It's been nearly 2.5 years. Can you publicly acknowledge that you did lose the 2020 election?
Let me just go on. If you look at True the Vote, they found millions of votes on camera, on government cameras, where they were stuffing ballot boxes.
You know, just to pause there for a second, because this particular point did occupy so much of last night's town hall and also so much of the commentary afterward. It seemed that liberals expected Donald Trump not to say the thing that he's been saying pretty much every day since the end of the election, which is that he believes it was stolen. And Caitlin and other commentators after the event seemed not to anticipate that Trump was going to not just make the more pointed election stolen claims about briefcases full of ballots and stuff, all of which are, of course, false and debunked, but also point to some of these other issues like the influence of the Hunter laptop case not being reported on as kind of a soft influence. And a kind of influence I think a lot of voters might agree had an effect on the election, the same way that so many Democrats talk about Hillary's email coverage and Jim Comey, et cetera, having such an effect on the outcome in 2016.
100%. Trump there was bringing up legitimate criticisms. I mean, what the Twitter files revealed, the massive amount of coordination, cooperation, pressure from the federal government to censor content. He referenced the 50 intelligence officials. I've referenced it a couple times talking about it. He's absolutely right. The intelligence officials who said the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation, and that was cited by the media and by Politico, by Biden himself to justify ignoring the story. He is right to complain about all those things. Those were unfair hits on him, things that went against him. They do not contribute to the election being rigged in the sense of voting machines or that kind of stuff. When you say rigged, well, what I think most people mean by that, it was literally violating the law.
Yeah.
A story, you know, misinterpreting facts, lying to people, misleading them, that's not illegal. That's just campaigning. And right, some of the campaigning they were doing against Trump was unfair and bad, just as some of the campaigning he was doing against Biden was unfair and bad. Doesn't make it rigged. And
yes.
So I would further say, look, he talked about that stuff. He wanted to relitigate 2020 and January 6th for the first. It seemed like at least the first 25 minutes, half an hour of the show. Of course, CNN wants to keep talking about that. That's their whole audience.
Well, they did, but they didn't. I mean, they did, but they were losing. I mean, it's hard to say because I don't think it's a losing issue because I think that Trump is wrong substantively. But in terms of how it came off, one, because they had a Trump-friendly, conservative, independent-leaning audience, their applause gave the appearance that whatever Trump was saying was very much appreciated and agreed with by the country as a whole. And obviously there is a significant portion of the country that does agree with it. But moreover, because Caitlin Collins at no point validated the parts of the argument that I think are valid, the fact of the liberal-leaning news media, or at least anti-Trump news media, putting their finger on the scale with respect to certain kind of these media issues, it gave Trump the ability to put Caitlin Collins in the position of being a bad faith actor, despite being a conservative herself, and was able to create this adversarial relationship.
Not
she used to be on Fox.
Well, right. She's a conservative. I mean, she's a conservative in the same way that Joe Scarborough and Nicole Wallace and all those people are conservative.
Well, sure, but she is someone who, like Alyssa Farrow, who gave a lot of commentary afterward, actively. I mean, Alyssa Farrow worked for Donald Trump. I think there's this odd way that we can lean too hard into the rhino narrative. There are people who are legitimately conservatives and would happily vote for a Republican candidate and who do not like Democrats.
I don't think Caitlin Collins is one of them, but sure.
Okay. I can't speak to her mens rea. All I know is that he was able to paint her as a bad faith actor despite being a self-identified Republican because she didn't validate. I'm sitting here as an independent, far left-leaning person, but I can validate certain aspects of what Donald Trump was saying. That didn't happen, and that combined with the validation from the audience, I think put CNN in the position of wanting to talk about this issue but not wanting to lose on this issue, and they came off as losing on this issue.
Well, I mean, they would have come off losing because it's a Republican audience. The audience was going to agree with Trump and not agree with the moderator.
That was a choice.
Regardless. Yeah, that's how they set it up. But Trump has no problem with the Republican base. They're going to turn out for him. They're going to support in a general election. They're going to support him. Virtually all Republicans are. But what we've seen from the midterm results, from general polling, is that relitigating 2020 and focusing on January 6th it's not a losing issue with Republicans necessarily. It's a losing issue for people who could conceivably vote for Trump but might not.
Right.
And let me finish. Talking about that this is an opportunity to address people watching CNN who are not voting for Trump and doing outreach to them, maybe bringing them back to the fold, maybe to the fold for the first time. And what he obsessed over for the first however long chunk of this town hall are things that will not only not win them over, but will alienate them. So, as it's been shown time and time again. He should pivot wildly from talking about this. Caitlin Collins wants to talk about it. He should say, stop obsessing about this. Here's my agenda moving forward. Our country is a mess. I'm fixing the economy. He should avoid, delay, pivot, move away from those subjects. That would be if he wants to win the presidency again, that's what he should do.
So, well, two things. One, I think Caitlin Collins was trying to pivot away from it. She kept saying she would offer a rejoinder to Trump and then immediately step on her own point and move to a new topic in a way which I think rhetorically
No, I'm criticizing Trump for not doing it, not her.
I understand. You're saying that it's a bad issue for Trump and that Trump should want to pivot away from it. I'm saying the opposite happened, and I disagree with your premise. One, Caitlin Collins, in fact, was trying to pivot away from it because I think she perceived it would be a bad issue for her and for liberals. And I think that she is right, as evidenced by some of the commentary we saw after the debate, where CNN put together some panels of voters, these kind of undecided Trump independent, leaning voters, and asked them whether they thought what they thought about the whole colloquy on the election fraud. To a T, all of them wanted to not talk about it, but that didn't influence their opinion negatively. They found that the CNN host was harping on it too much. They are over it. They don't mind that Donald Trump believes that election fraud happened. They are more concerned with the issues that are present today. They wanted to talk about economics. They wanted to talk about issues that are affecting their lives. So I don't think it negatively hurts Trump in the way that people perceive it to do. They want to stop talking about it because it's maybe a little uncomfortable, or because they frankly agree with Donald Trump on a lot of these softer issues, especially like the fact that the media was biased against Trump, the fact that the Hunter Biden laptop story was suppressed, etc. In the same way, I would still want to point out that Democrats still feel that way about Hillary Clinton's coverage in 2016. And the more that liberals press on that issue, I think the more uncomfortable it is for voters, because they're not disentangling the parts that they frankly think are true. And then they start to feel beat up on by people like Caitlin Collins, who want them to insist and swear a blood oath that nothing
liberals
wrong
are
happened
pressing
in the
on
election.
these issues because they know that Trump cannot win independents, moderates, etc., if we keep talking about them. And Trump can't help himself but keep talking about them. The people you're talking about, the Republicans that makes them uncomfortable, they're all going to vote for Trump anyway in a general election. So the question is, can he bring people back into the fold, or can he get new people? And we know from the polling and from the midterms and from all of that he can't if all he talks about is January 6th and the 2020 election. He's got to win the next election. Stop talking about the last election.
What I'm trying to say, Robby, is that the perception was not that Trump was harping on those subjects. The perception was that it was the first question out of Caitlin Collins' mouth, that the perception was that Trump gave clear answers on those. And that because Caitlin Collins doesn't agree with those answers, because she thinks that Trump is lying about those answers, which substantively he was on the hard actual accusations of voter election fraud, that she was the one that wouldn't let the issue go.
So after the town hall, there was a CNN panel with a lot of people, Van Jones, some other people, and Byron Donalds, who's this Republican.
Exactly.
But he did what Trump should have done. When he's asked about how can you stomach the lying about the election, he just doesn't answer the question and he starts talking about everything else. That's what Trump could have done. But he doesn't. He can't help himself. He needs to start talking about the 2020 election. So many other Republican figures who fit the description you're saying, who maybe agree with Trump a little bit or they're uncomfortable with it, whatever, but they want to talk about the issues they know can theoretically be winning issues for the Republican Party. He did that beautifully. Byron Donalds did. Donald Trump cannot help himself. And that's why he's going to be a much weaker candidate than he could be or other Republicans could be, because he wants to talk about things that are losing issues for the party.
So I don't think that the gap between what Byron Donalds did and what Donald Trump did is as wide as you're characterizing it. And I think that Donald Trump is the edifice on which Byron Donalds' refusal to commit to an answer on whether or not he thinks the 2020 election was stolen is built. Byron was able to, what Byron said to that panel of everybody else being liberals, basically, except for one other man, I think, what he said was, I'm not going to give you the answer that you want to give. I refuse to make this commitment that you want me. You want me to say things in a certain way, and I will not do it.
And unlike Trump, who said them exactly in the way that CNN wanted him to say them.
Well, no, CNN obviously wanted him to say the election wasn't stolen, and Donald Trump said the election was stolen. But I think that most viewers are going to look at Byron Donalds, and most people on the panel looked at Byron Donalds and said, you're doing the same thing that Trump is doing. You're refusing to acknowledge that Biden is the president of the United States and that he fairly won the election. So I get that Byron Donalds...
He was refusing to play their game. Trump played their game. He played it exactly according to what they wanted. I don't know. Disagree. You got to decide for yourselves. I guess, before we go, we should talk about a little bit substantively about what he said on Ukraine and all of that. I thought I thought he was strongest again when he moved away from that stuff. Finally, got to substantive policy, and what he said about Ukraine was going to be appealing to a lot of voters.
I disagree. I think that he was actually very weak on Ukraine, and it was an issue that Caitlin Donalds should have focused on, but did not. Because what Trump's base actually cares about is whether or not he is going to cut funding to Ukraine and get America out of that war. And Trump very clearly, uncomfortably pivoted to the idea that Europe is not paying its fair share to help Ukraine in the war, but not that America should stop funding Ukraine or get out of it. And he kept saying things like, if I were president, the war wouldn't have happened, and if I were president again, I would end the war in a day. But he would not make a specific commitment to actually cutting funding aid of any kind to Ukraine. Now, what liberals chose to do in that moment is to make Trump give some loyalty pledge and say, do you want Zelensky to win the war? Do you want Ukraine to win the war? Are you Putin's puppet? And make those kind of declarations, which are not what Trump's voters care about. Again, what Trump's voters care about is whether or not he can credibly be framed as an anti-war candidate. But liberals, obsessed with what their own voters are interested in, wanted to make it about Putin and Russia and election influence and Russiagate and all these other kinds of things. And this was the fundamental problem with the debate. I tweeted this last night, and of all people, Ben Shapiro also tweeted this idea this morning, that because this was framed fundamentally as a debate for independent voters, for people who are ambivalent about whether or not they want to vote for Trump again or for the first time. They filled the audience with those people. But all the questions were framed for a CNN liberal left-leaning audience.
The questions from Caitlin Collins. The questions from the audience members were from Republican primary voters.
Which, by the way, he mostly declined to answer directly, in which Caitlin Collins didn't redirect. Caitlin Collins had an opportunity to step in and say, I'm going to defend the voter. If Donald Trump was going to be rude to her, at some point he called her a nasty woman, where you can say what you want about her in the questions and her job, but she was polite and decorous the whole time. So if you want to stop Donald Trump from being able to kind of railroad you the way that he did railroad her during that town hall, she could have stepped behind, substituted the voters' for her and say, well, let me just redouble down on what this voter asked. Will you actually commit to whatever the question was? And instead of doing that, he was able to dodge out of that. But the point I'm trying to make is that what Caitlin Collins was doing and what the CNN framing was to ask a bunch of questions that were of interest to liberals, to an audience who doesn't care about those questions, and not ask any of the questions that could have become wedge issues between potential Trump voters and Donald Trump himself.
One of the people who asked the questions did get at that, referencing DeSantis' war on Disney.
Yes,
toward
100%.
the end. That was a great question,
Yep.
and I was really looking forward to see what Trump was going to do. He's not shied away from attacking DeSantis in the past, so this was his time to say, yeah, this is not the Republican Party I believe in, like fighting wars with companies, I hate wokeness, whatever, but this seems like a huge waste of time, and he didn't. He went back to Biden.
So
that was
the question was pointedly, should state power or hypothetically federal power be used to bully businesses in this way? I believe the guy who asked the question was like maybe speaking a small business owner.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we got like one de sanctimonious in the course of the town hall.
But was he even, and when he said that, I'm not sure he was even referencing DeSantis. Wasn't he calling Biden sanctimonious? He wasn't calling him DeSanctimonious.
That's funny. Well,
I don't know.
Look, in the context of that question, you're completely right. He dodged the question of whether or not that's an appropriate use of state power. And Caitlin Collins could have said, hey, this is the question. Conservatives across the country care about this. This man, this voter in front of you cares about this. And she let him get away with that sort of thing.
Again, you said I would describe her as a former Republican, former conservative. I don't think she necessarily even understands the nuances.
Well, I'm not a conservative in the least, and I would have forced Donald Trump to answer the question. So that's not the point. The point is whether or not she was fulfilling her role as advocating for.
You certainly understand the differences in conservative ideology better than your average host on CNN. I think that is uncontroversial.